I used to think you'd know right away. That true love, when it was real, shouted loudly, broke down doors, cut through crowds, and made your heart stumble with its intensity. I thought the so-called great love came with fireworks, with an epiphany that struck like lightning. But life, with the gentleness of someone who whispers truths only after pride wears out, taught me that some loves don't arrive exploding, they arrive by staying. And that's exactly what I didn't see, because he was always there, always, like the wallpaper of my life, a constant, discreet, safe presence. He was the shoulder I cried on without ceremony, the number I called when everything went wrong, the first to text me when I disappeared. And still, I spent years looking for love in the wrong places, with the wrong men, in the wrong urgencies. I threw myself into relationships where I had to prove myself constantly, where my silence was a problem, and my laughter had to mold to someone else's timing, and he just stayed, without demanding, without requiring, without drifting away. Sometimes I thought he was too good to be real. Other times, I confess, I thought maybe he wanted me in a way I couldn't reciprocate. But deep down, the truth was different. I just wasn't ready to see. Because when you grow up believing love is adrenaline, kindness feels like too little. When you're used to absences, constancy seems uninteresting. I got involved with people who challenged me, who made me feel butterflies, even if those butterflies later died in my stomach, and I overlooked the one who only gave me peace, until life wore me out. And in that exhaustion, when I stopped running, I looked to the side, and there he was, where he'd always been. The middle of the journey began with a silence. Not the silence between us. That was always there, comfortable and light, like the pause between two good songs, but the silence within me. After yet another disappointment, another failed attempt to find someone who saw me beyond what I showed, I stopped. It was as if my entire body said, enough. I canceled dinners, muted conversations, declined invitations I'd once accepted out of fear of being alone. For the first time, I chose silence not as emptiness, but as shelter. And it was in that shelter that he entered without making a sound. He showed up at the end of an ordinary afternoon, with 2 coffee mugs and a packet of cookies in his coat pocket. He said he sensed I needed to talk, even if it was just to sit in silence. And I let him. I sat beside him on the couch, and for hours we said nothing. But it was in that nothing that everything began to change. I started noticing the details that had always been there. The way he fixed his hair when he was nervous, how he always turned the mug to the right side on the tray, as if waiting for someone to sit down. How he looked at me when I spoke about things even I didn't know I felt. And then, without warning, one day he didn't come. Not because he'd given up, but because he was tired of waiting for someone who didn't know how to look at him. He sent me a short message. I'm here, but I don't know if you see me anymore. And that hurt. It hurt like a truth spoken at the wrong time. I spent the night rereading that sentence. I wondered how many times he'd loved me in silence. How many times he'd wished to be in the place of someone who made me cry. And for the first time, with honesty, I asked myself what I felt when he smiled at me. That night, I couldn't sleep. I wandered the house like someone trying to find, among furniture and silences, an explanation that made sense. I sat on the living room floor with the lights off, surrounded only by the soft glow of the kitchen lamp and the thoughts pounding in my head like persistent rain. It wasn't longing for an ex that troubled me, nor resentment for stories that didn't bloom. It was something deeper, an echo, a name that insisted on forming inside me, even as I fought to push it away. I remembered all the times he was there, and I didn't know how to see. the way he laughed at my bad jokes just to see me smile. How he always remembered details even I forgot. The constant gentleness with which he never demanded anything, only made himself present. He was the shoulder when everything fell apart, the steady voice when mine disappeared. And I was so blind looking for grand gestures that I didn't notice the grandest one, constancy. That love without performance, without spectacle, but that sustained. I remember the next day, I went to the same cafe where we always met by chance, or so I thought. I sat at our usual table, ordered the same coffee, and waited. But he didn't come. For the first time, his absence hurt more than any breakup I'd ever lived through, because it was in the emptiness of the chair across from me that everything finally made sense. There, alone, with trembling hands holding a mug that cooled too quickly, I said softly, almost like a confession that took years to be born, it was him. And I repeated it. It was always him. The phrase wasn't new. It was old. It was something my heart already knew, but my head, with all its noise, defenses, and escapes, stubbornly ignored. And there, on that unglamorous afternoon, without magical coincidences or obvious signs, I knew. Act 1 of my love life was over, because true love had found me long ago. I was the one who took so long to seek. It took 2 whole days to muster the courage to write the message. I deleted and rewrote it so many times, my phone died more than once. It was just, "Can we talk?" But it felt like each word carried the weight of all the silences that came before. When I finally hit send, my heart sank in my chest as if I'd jumped off a cliff, not knowing if there was a net below. And even though I knew he always replied quickly, every second of waiting felt like a judgment. When the notification appeared, my hands sweated and I had to take a deep breath before opening it. He replied calmly, in the way only he could. "Of course, whenever you want." No question mark, no demands, just availability, as it had always been. We arranged to meet late in the afternoon in the park between our neighborhoods, where he used to meet me to clear my head on days I called saying I couldn't take it anymore. As I walked there, each step was a memory. The day he lent me his coat without a word. The hot chocolate he brought to my door the night before Christmas when I was sick. The note he left in my mailbox when I lost my job and didn't want to talk to anyone. "You're bigger than all this," he wrote. And I kept it. Of course I kept it. But I never said I read it. Never said I cried reading it. When I saw him sitting on the bench with his gray coat and his gaze fixed on the lake, I wanted to run, but fear pulled me by the ankles. How do you tell someone you saw love too late? That you took so long to realize what he'd known for so long? I sat beside him with a smile I could barely hold, and for a few minutes we just listened to the sound of leaves being swept by the wind. I couldn't speak. And then he looked at me, that calm, direct look that always unraveled me, and said, without irony, without pain, without sarcasm, "You saw, didn't you?" And that's when I cried, not out of guilt, but out of relief, because he knew. He always knew. And even so, he stayed. After that day in the park, something in me began to change. Not in a grand or rapid way. It was a silent change, like the sun slowly returning after a long winter. I started observing every detail with more presence. His messages, which I used to answer in haste, I now read with care. Our meetings, which once seemed like mere coincidences, now carried the weight of small, conscious choices. And for the first time, I was choosing him back, without distractions, without reservations, not out of impulse, not out of need, but because it was him. And it had been all along. I started noticing details I'd missed. How he always remembered how I took my coffee, with a pinch of cinnamon, even when I said it didn't matter. How he held his mug with both hands on cold days. How he walked a step behind me in crowded places, just to make sure I didn't get lost in the crowd. Those gestures, so small and so him, began to touch me with a force no love speech could match. Because it wasn't about saying, it was about being, and he had always been. At every birthday no one else remembered, in every, "Did you get home okay?" text, in every silence he didn't fill out of politeness but respected because he understood. Little by little, we grew closer again, without definitions, without labels. It was a kind of love that didn't need a frame. It was the landscape itself, and I learned to lower my guard, to talk about my days without fear of seeming weak, to speak about old loves without guilt for starting something new. Thomas, that was his name, by the way. A common name, but one that slowly became my safe place. And Thomas, with all the patience of someone who's waited too long, listened. Not just with his ears, but with his eyes, with his body, with his time. There was one day in particular that stayed with me. I had a silly anxiety attack, one of those that comes without explanation, and sent him a confused message saying I couldn't meet. He replied only, "Want me to come to you?" I didn't answer, but half an hour later, he was at my door with cheese bread and chamomile tea. He sat on the living room floor and looked at me as if saying, "You don't have to pretend to be strong here." And I cried again, not from pain, but from the relief of finally not having to carry everything alone. It was that day I realized love doesn't come with fireworks or promises. It comes with constancy, with presence, with someone who shows up even when you have nothing beautiful to offer. And for the first time I understood, it was him, from the beginning. It took time, but I understood. Love wasn't a bolt of lightning from the sky, nor a story written in capital letters. It was made of constancy, of presences that don't announce themselves but repeat. And it was in that understanding that I began to act differently, not out of obligation, but out of a desire to care too, to give back, even without him asking. I started paying more attention to what he said, and even more to what he didn't say. I learned he slept poorly on Mondays because of old insomnia. So I began sending soft messages before bed as a way of saying, "You're not alone." I remembered he liked old movies, so I planned a night with one of his favorites, without saying it was for him. I just let him discover it himself, in the quiet smile that came in the first minute of the film. I began to understand his gestures as a language, and to respond in the same frequency. I also let him know me for real. I told him about my failures, the wounds that hadn't yet healed, the dreams I'd shelved out of fear of trying again. And he listened with that rare attention of someone who doesn't want to fix, just to understand. One night, as we walked hand in silence, he said something that stuck with me. "I was always here, but now, you're here too." That unraveled me inside, because it was true. For the first time, I was fully there. No running, no excuses. It was during this time that people around me started noticing the change. My sister commented that I seemed calmer. A friend said my laugh felt more genuine. But what no one knew, what only he and I knew, was that this change didn't come from him alone. It came from me, from finally stopping the chase for perfect love and accepting real love, the love that had been in front of me all along, the same one who, years ago, helped me pick up papers that fell from my binder in college, who laughed at my broken umbrella without making me feel ridiculous, who was my friend when I just wanted to forget love, and who, without me noticing, stayed, even when everyone else left. At the end of that autumn, we were in a small cafe when he looked at me with the calm eyes of someone who waits without demanding, and he asked, almost whispering, "Are you Sure. And for the first time in my life, I had no doubts. I took his hand across the table, looked at him with everything that fit in my silence, and answered, "It was always you. I just took too long to see." And he smiled like someone who, at last, hears what they've waited a lifetime to hear. Saying yes to him wasn't like crossing a threshold and leaving everything behind. It was more like turning on a soft light inside a home that was already mine, but one I'd never fully seen. We began to live this love like someone breathing deeply after swimming against the current for too long. There were no exaggerated promises or rehearsed speeches. There was choice, daily, complicit, true. At first I found the peace strange. I was used to passions that came like storms, with thunder and dramatic escapes. But with him, everything was different. It was as if time had finally learned to move at our pace. He called me for no reason, and yet it always felt like there was one. He brought flowers not for an occasion, but because he'd passed a stall and thought of me. Sometimes he just showed up at the door with a coffee in hand and the same smile from when we were young. And I let him. I received it. I allowed myself to live that love that doesn't shout but remains. I started making plans with him, not the kind that fill calendars or require packed bags. Simple plans like, shall we cook together on Friday? Or what if we planned something on the balcony? Small decisions that together built something greater than any grand plan, a shared life. For the first time, my home felt less empty. Not because it was full, but because I no longer felt alone inside myself. Nights were different now. Not because he slept beside me every day, but because, even at a distance, his presence was a home. I woke up and thought of him with tranquility, not with that suffocating urgency of someone afraid to lose, but with the sweetness of someone who knows they've found. And that's how life began to taste different, a light, continuous, whole taste. I no longer needed to chase stories that hurt me to feel alive. I was alive and whole, because the love that had always been there finally found me at the exact moment I was ready to be found. Not every day was bright, and I knew that. Life doesn't grant eternal reprieves just because we find the right love. And it was on one of those cloudy mornings when the body feels heavier than usual that I got the test results. It wasn't an earthquake, but it wasn't light either. And as much as I knew how to handle pain, as much as my story was made of endured silences, an old fear returned. The fear of being too much of a burden, too much trouble, too much pain, for someone to stay. He arrived that afternoon without knowing anything. He just showed up, as he always did, one hand holding a book and the other ready to touch my shoulder. I wanted to hide, to stall, to change the subject. But he looked at me and asked with his eyes, without haste, without demands. And in that moment, I understood. His love didn't need to be shielded from my vulnerability. It was there, precisely there, that it grew stronger. I told him everything. Without embellishments, without trying to seem stronger than I was. He didn't try to fix anything. He just held my hand, ran his thumb over my fingers and said softly, "I'm here." That was more healing than any medication. In the days that followed, he was even more present. He called to remind me to drink water, showed up with soups. He tried to cook, always oversalting them, brought blankets and books and old songs he thought I should hear. Sometimes he just lay on the couch beside me and let the silence fill everything. And it was there, in that unassuming care, that I realized I had never been so accompanied. I began to heal, and not just from what my body was facing, but from the scars my earlier life had left, from the mistaken idea that love comes to save us. It doesn't. True love doesn't arrive to save. It arrives to walk alongside, And he did that with mastery. He didn't push me, didn't drag me. He just walked with me, one step at a time. And with each of those steps, I felt stronger. More woman, more his, and more myself. There was no marriage proposal, no ring hidden in dessert, no movie scene. What there was him walking through the front door with the newspaper under his arm, complaining about the cold and asking if I wanted tea. And it was in that banal moment that I realized we'd been married in soul for a long time, because life with him was that, a sequence of presences that said more than any ceremony could. And I didn't need more proof, because loving was no longer a daily choice. It was my natural state. He started leaving his toothbrush at my place. We began splitting the monthly groceries. His keys stayed by my entrance. Our calendars blended without us noticing. And when someone asked if we were together for real, I just smiled. Because how do you explain that the truest love I've known never needed to be announced, just lived? One night, as we folded freshly washed clothes, he looked at me with that look that always came before something that didn't need saying. And he said, "Did you know from the beginning it was you?" I laughed like someone laughing at themselves for taking so long, for looking so far around when the answer was right there, standing beside me through so many chapters of life. And I answered, "Now I know. It was you, always." We didn't close the night with long kisses or eternal vows. We just kept folding clothes, listening to soft music on the radio. But inside, something settled with the firmness of things built to last. I was no longer the woman searching. I was the woman who at last had found. And sometimes that's what love does. It waits. It endures. It accompanies. And when we're ready, it simply stays. The years passed faster than I imagined, but with a sweetness only shared time can bring. Our mornings now start slower. He always gets up first, makes the coffee with hands a bit shakier, but the same care as always. Sometimes he forgets where he left his glasses, and I pretend not to know, just to see the funny way he searches the whole house. And in the end, they're always in his shirt pocket. We have our quirks. He insists on cutting the newspaper with scissors to save articles he thinks I'll like. I keep leaving notes inside the books he reads, as if the paper could whisper, "I'm here." We share life like someone learning to dance with steps that adjust, stumble, and start again, but always together. On Sundays, we still go to the same bookstore where it all began. No one else knows it was there. He waited for me so many afternoons, just to see me, but I know. And every time we walk in, I squeeze his hand a little tighter, because even after everything, it still moves me to think that he stayed, that he chose to stay. Today, when someone asks me the secret, I don't talk about luck. I talk about presence, about listening, about respected silence and touch that doesn't ask permission because it already has a home. I talk about patience, his for waiting for me, mine, which I had to learn. I talk about recognizing love not by the fireworks, but by the warmth that doesn't fade even in storms. He's here now, napping with a book fallen in his lap. His head tilts slowly, his hair is whiter, his breathing calmer. I watch him in silence and think it was him from the beginning. And today, finally, I'm here too, whole after everything. Because when love is true, it doesn't need to be quick. It just needs to be real.